The village of Kingsmarrow wore summer like a borrowed garment, too fine for everyday use, and slipped on with a certain self-consciousness. The afternoon lay washed in soft gold. Swallows wrote cryptic messages upon the air, and the lawns of Langford Hall, terraced in long green shelves, gazed down towards the ornamental lake as though admiring themselves in a looking-glass. Beneath a pergola, heavy with wisteria, a handful of people spoke in voices that held to decorum and avoided, as English voices will, the true interest of the heart. Captain Arthur Hastings, lately returned from South America, and still unable to decide whether he missed the enthusiasm or the dust, stood with his hands behind his back and feigned a study of the sundial. It said the time was 20 minutes to 4, which his own watch contradicted by 5 minutes. He frowned, as though time and truth ought to match in a well-run garden. That tiny, pedantic quarrel of minutes was the sort of discrepancy which, he knew, would have interested his remarkable friend. He smiled at the thought. Poirot, who could extract a confession from a carelessly placed paper knife, would have teased the sundial into telling him what it had for luncheon. But Poirot was not here. Hastings had come alone to Kingsmarrow to spend a few days with an old acquaintance, Julian Langford, whom he had known in town before the war. Langford had written with a breezy invitation. "Come for the weekend, Hastings. We are to announce my engagement, and I want a friendly face. There are faces enough here, but they are all, in one way or another, ancestral." Hastings, who likes a celebration, had accepted, and now found himself amid the murmur of congratulations and the scent of wisteria, which is sweet but not cloying, and reminded him faintly of old letters. The house itself, of warm, honeyed stone, wore its centuries without vanity. It had a facade so entirely at ease with its proportions that one forgave the rather pugnacious Corinthian columns added by an ancestor who had liked his architecture as he liked his politics, impossible to ignore. The hall had in recent years been left predominantly to the care of its matriarch, Lady Eleanor Langford, whose portrait in the dining-room, a composed woman with a long neck and eyes that saw too much, set the tone. Hastings had not yet made her acquaintance, though she was expected to appear upon the lawn. Lady Eleanor, it seemed, had been indisposed since luncheon. "They do take these things to heart," said a voice behind him, light and a trifle mocking. "Mothers, I mean, engagements, which ought to be simple matters of champagne and cake, turn suddenly into dynastic earthquakes." Hastings turned to find a young woman at his elbow. She had the sort of face that becomes interesting only after 5 minutes' acquaintance, steady blue eyes, an amused mouth, and an air of having observed better jokes than the one currently on offer. She wore a pale dress and a string of pearls, not expensive but well chosen. "Miss," he began. "Alton," she supplied. "Vera Alton, which makes me, by way of introduction, the bride-to-be." "My dear," cried Hastings, colouring, "I should have recognized." "No one ever recognizes the central figure in a family drama," she said. "We are all too occupied by the chorus." She nodded towards the pergola, where 3 persons had arranged themselves with an exactitude which could not be accidental. "There you have them. Dr. Merrick, who has lived in Kingsmarrow as long as anyone can remember, and is therefore considered a scientific authority on gossip. Mrs. Phipps, the housekeeper, who combines the virtues of a Roman matron with the curiosity of a cat. And Mr. Armand Vale, family friend, which usually means someone who knows where all the emotionally inconvenient bodies are buried." Hastings glanced at the trio. Dr. Merrick was a compact man in his 60s, clean-shaven, with eyes as bright as cufflinks and a habit of tapping his pipe stem against his canine tooth before speaking. Mrs. Phipps, squared about the shoulders, had that air of firm propriety which declares certain topics out of bounds, even as it longs to enter them. As for Mr. Armand Vale, he was slender, elegant, olive-skinned, and wore his restraint like a well-cut suit. "They are discussing me," Vera said calmly. "It is a comfort to know one's position in the world." "Do you think it offends Lady Eleanor that Julian is to marry the daughter of a barrister who became, oh horrors, a shopkeeper. Father made his own way, Captain Hastings. He sold books, and then he published them, and then he acquired 2 newspapers and a conviction that people are improved by what they are told to read. Many men have done worse, Hastings observed. He liked her tone. It had candour without brazenness, and a humour that did not protect itself with malice. Many mothers-in-law have thought so, Vera said. I am not sure Lady Eleanor is among them. At that moment, a man came striding across the lawn with the slightly harried competence of a host who has learned better than to appear hurried. He was tall, fair, in his early 30s, with a grin that could convince a row of pins to stand upright. Julian Langford came straight to Vera, took both her hands and kissed them, so that his sincerity seemed to perform a little bow of its own. "Forgive me, my dear, I have abandoned you among the natives," he said. "Hastings, old fellow, you have arrived, and I have already failed as a friend. You must be bored to a wraith." "On the contrary," said Hastings, "I am quite content. Your garden has a talent for conversation even when one is silent." Julian laughed. "The Wisteria, it says dreadful things when it gets going. Come, have you met everyone? Dr. Merrick, Mrs. Phipps, and Mr. Vale you will know by hearsay at least. And my sister Lydia is somewhere about, probably annotating the conversation in her head. She is a terror," with a penciled remark. Vera disengaged her hands. "I will collect Miss Lydia," she said, "or be collected. It is all one." She made her way towards the east walk, where a slender young woman in a moss-green frock pretended to be absorbed by the rosebeds. Lydia Langford had the long, impatient hands of someone who wants to turn a page before she has finished reading it. When Vera spoke to her, she flinched almost imperceptibly, then smiled very brightly. Hastings, who had learned during the war to estimate nerves as one might estimate the weather, took note of that small start as one notes a change in wind direction. Not fear, no, not fear, but expectation, sharpened into dread. "Lydia does not care for engagements," said Julian, following his gaze with a rueful affection. "She thinks they are arrangements made by people who do not deserve the oddness of life." "And Lady Eleanor?" Hastings asked. "My mother," Julian said, and the word had a smile in it, "thinks life is tolerable when people behave according to their type. She always dislikes it at first when they do not. Then she reorganizes the facts, moves a cushion or two, and discovers that it was her idea all along." He was interrupted by the soft, decisive chime of the library clock, striking the quarter. It came through the open French windows in a tone that suggested it had been tuned to command attention. The same few notes had sounded the hour at luncheon. Hastings recognized them with a small physical memory of roast chicken and a tart lemon syllabub which had been offered twice, as if repetition confirmed goodness. He found himself glancing at the sundial again, which still lagged by 5 minutes. "Dr. Merrick," Julian called, "will you take pity on a wretch and open a bottle? We must contrive a toast. I sent for champagne to be put on ice." "It is there, Mr. Julian," said Mrs. Phipps, with the faintest emphasis upon the honorific which told Hastings she had known him in round knees and scraped elbows. But Lady Eleanor sent down word that the bottles were to remain unopened until she herself had given consent for any to be poured. A little movement passed around the group, so slight that it would not have disturbed a feather. Julian's smile did not alter. He merely said, "Ah, quite right," in a tone that made virtue seem a comfortable garment, and turned again to Hastings. "My mother," he remarked, "knows that champagne is an irrevocable act." "Is she sufficiently recovered to join us?" asked Dr. Merrick, who had come up with his pipe and a glass he did not intend to fill. "She has had her afternoon draught," Dr. Merrick added, as if anticipating objection. "I saw to it myself after luncheon. These warm days produce hypotension in certain temperaments. She requires quiet and a little tonic." "Then quiet she shall have," Julian said. Yet the line between his eyebrows remained. From the far side of the lawn there came a sudden angry whir of wings. A wasp, drunk on fallen nectar, blundered near the pergola. Mrs. Phipps, without ostentation, reached into her apron pocket and produced a blue glass wasp trap of a kind Hastings had not seen in years. She set it upon the small wrought-iron table with the air of a magician revealing the solution to a parlour trick. "Mr. Vale," she said, "you will please not waste good wine upon the insects. There is sweet water and vinegar for the purpose." Mr. Vale bowed. "Madam Phipps, your prudence is surpassed only by your foresight. I had not intended to commit sacrilege, but now I shall not do so by accident." It was a trivial scene, yet, later, Hastings would recall the blue of the bottle and the lazy angle at which it caught the sun, and how the wasp circled, as if unable to believe that temptation had been arranged for it with such exactness. An older gentleman approached from the direction of the yew walk, the Reverend Mr. Goodfellow, vicar of Kingsmarrow, in a clerical collar that survived better than the rest of his laundry. He had the gently audacious expression of a man who habitually says uncomfortable things in a kindly voice and carries the habit as a blessing. "My dear Julian," he cried, "is it to be felicitations? I have, within the last 5 minutes, prepared a speech on the nature of earthly unions, which I am sure will be of service when no one is listening." "Reverend," said Julian, "you upon a platform are as irresistible as Mrs. Phipps with a broom." "Indeed, I have been compared to both more often than one would suppose," the vicar replied amiably. "And Miss Alton?" He inclined his head towards Vera. "We are gratified to receive you into our village mythology." "Carefully as a new saint?" Vera asked. "As a new fact," he returned. "We are a community much afflicted by our own memories." Hastings moved away a little, out of delicacy, as if the very air required room to dilate about all these polite sentences, and let his feet take him along the path. Garden paths have a way of soliciting confidences from well-shod men. He found himself before a small wooden door let into the red brick garden wall. It was shut, but the key was in the lock, an old brass chub, bright with recent handling. Beyond the wall came the muffled whir of a mower from the meadow. Tom Quill, the head gardener, was at work. A glance through the keyhole, yes, childishly done, but the door offered the sort of keyhole that announces itself like a stage whisper, showed Hastings the rougher world beyond the ornamental borders. Stooks of cut grass, a barrow, and Quill himself, shirt-sleeved, his forearms burnt brown, his hair the colour of dark straw. Quill saw him, raised a hand in a greeting that was almost a salute, and came to the door. "Beg pardon, sir," he said. "Lady Eleanor doesn't like guests beyond the wall, says it spoils the illusion." "Quite right," said Hastings, stepping back. "Illusions are delicate things, Quill." "So they are," the gardener agreed, "but sometimes they grow too thick and choke what's real. Same as ivy." Hastings smiled and returned to the lawn, and to the illusion which Langford Hall managed with admirable skill. The scene had altered slightly. Mr. Vale had shifted his position by inches so that he stood between Dr. Merrick and the iron table. Mrs. Phipps, in moving the wasp trap, had revealed a faint ring upon the table where some vessel, perhaps a glass, had stood and then been removed. Lydia had joined Vera, who held her hand, and the Reverend Goodfellow had begun a harmless anecdote about the perils of Barrowsford cheese at the parish picnic. "Captain Hastings!" came a clear voice behind him, a voice that did not need to be raised in order to be heard. "I am happy to welcome you to Langford Hall." He turned and saw Lady Eleanor at last. She was smaller than he had expected, and slighter, but such figures often convey command more absolutely than size can contrive. Her hair, almost entirely white, was arranged simply. She wore grey silk with an ivory fichu folded across the chest and a cameo pinned at the throat. Her eyes were grave and quick, and there was a cast to the mouth which suggested she had been in the habit of withholding final judgment until others had betrayed theirs. "Lady Eleanor," Hastings said, "you do me honour." "I do my son honour by greeting his guest," she returned, not unkindly. "Julian, my dear, you must present me properly to Miss Alton." Julian did so. Vera made a small curtsy which would have satisfied any court. Lady Eleanor's eyes dwelt upon her for a moment that was neither more nor less than necessary. Then she held out a hand, and Vera took it. "It is a pretty garden," Vera said with courage, "and generous to others besides itself. I have not seen Wisteria in such profusion." "It is not profuse," Lady Eleanor replied. "It is disciplined." "Dear Mamma," Julian began, but Lady Eleanor had already turned to Mrs. Phipps. "Mrs. Phipps, you may allow one bottle to be opened. No more. Dr. Merrick, you will take none yourself. You see too much as it is." The doctor rubbed his tooth with his pipe stem, unoffended. "Madam," he said, "I see only what is presented." "That is more than most people," Lady Eleanor returned. "Mr. Vale, I am to implore you, as I have implored you these 15 years, to stop making yourself agreeable to everyone at once." "Alas," said Mr. Vale with sincerity, "I never do it to everyone at once, only to those who look as if they might be lonely if I did not." "Then beware of Miss Lydia," Lady Eleanor said, very softly, and no one but Hastings, who happened to be looking, noticed the small stiffening in Lydia's hand where it rested against Vera's sleeve. The champagne was produced. The cork, with a discreet sigh, consented to relinquish the neck of the bottle. Bubbles rose like impossible promises. Julian spoke, and what he said was precisely right. He thanked his mother. He declared his happiness, without superlative. He offered to the vicar a portion of the afternoon sunshine in exchange for a blessing at the proper time. They all drank. Even Lady Eleanor touched the rim of her glass to her lips, and then set it aside. If there was a cloud, Hastings told himself, it was no more than the ghostly sort with which fine days are obligated to equip themselves, lest they be accused of frivolity. And yet he had the oddest sense that the party on the lawn was a scene already receding in time, and that he watched it through the wrong end of a telescope. He had wandered again, almost idly, towards the French windows that opened upon the library. One leaf stood ajar. Within, the room lay hushed, full of the steadied light that loves books. Upon the central table, beside a silver inkwell, lay a pair of spectacles and a small dish of pastilles in a china saucer, both too far from the chair to belong to forgetfulness. A faint, medicinal perfume drifted out, not unpleasant but precise. He noticed, too, a blotting pad that bore in reverse the last faint ghosts of written words. He could not read them, he observed, only that the hand was fine and the pressure light, as of someone not given to violence. "Lady Eleanor," he ventured, turning back, but she had already moved to the edge of the pergola and stood looking towards the far border, where a thread of path disappeared into shadow. Her face had altered. It is a strange thing how a face can in a second belong to the past more than to the present, how the bone remembers what youth once made of it, or age foretells what will be asked. Hastings, who considered himself the least fanciful of men, felt for a moment that he had seen her so once before. Standing upon a lawn, her hand upon a glass she did not mean to empty, calculating an outcome without cruelty and without mercy. "Captain Hastings," said the vicar at his shoulder, startling him, "you are looking into a room where many of our village decisions have been decided for us." "Lady Eleanor's library," Hastings said. "Lady Eleanor's court," the vicar corrected gently. "We live, all of us, in a parish. Some parishes are bounded by hedgerow and ditch, some by influence." There was more talk and more laughter, and the tiny clinks of glass on plate. Lydia said one of her edged things and then coloured at her own boldness. Vera answered in kind and gained herself, Hastings thought, an ally. Dr. Merrick diagnosed the weather. Mrs. Phipps diagnosed the vicar. Mr. Vale discovered that the blue trap caught bees as well as wasps and removed it with a gallant apology to the afternoon. Tom Quill, rolling his mower past the garden door on the far side of the wall, paused for a moment and looked in at the party before moving on with the resigned purpose of a man who knows that grass will keep growing. Then the library clock struck the hour. and though it was only 5, Hastings had the curious sensation that something had ended. Perhaps it was only the champagne. Perhaps it was the sight of Lady Eleanor, who had moved back to where the wisteria cast a net of purple shade across the lawn, and who stood lightly fanning herself with what looked like an invitation card. On the card, Hastings glimpsed for an instant a black ink flourish, the kind a woman makes when she has practiced, in the old fashion, to possess a signature that will not look untidy on a cheque. A footman, Robert, he believed, disappeared into the house, and another appeared as if exchanged, bearing a tray upon which sat a cut-glass decanter with a pale amber liquid and a tiny graduated glass such as doctors favour. Dr. Merrick took the tray, measured 2 teaspoons into the little glass, added water from a carafe, and returned the mixture to the decanter. "For Lady Eleanor," he said mildly, "tonics are not romantic, and romance is not tonic." It was such a day as should end with a pianola and the last light slanting across a carpet. It ended, instead, with a remark of Lady Eleanor's, which, though no one thought to remember it exactly later, seemed in retrospect to have been in the nature of a sentence past. She had turned to Vera Alton with a smile too deliberate to be entirely kind, and said something about the durability of gardens compared to arrangements of people. Vera, who had courage, said something back which acknowledged the durability of both when one took care. Hastings found the exchange oddly exhilarating and oddly like a duel in which 2 swords had met very politely in the middle and taken one another's measure. Then the sun, which had presided, shifted behind a cloud, and the wisteria's shade deepened to the colour of dusk before its time. Lydia shivered, though it was not cold. The vicar drew out his watch and discovered that it ran slow. Hastings, looking from the sundial to his wrist and back again, thought again of 5 minutes. It is in such small unison of trifles that a melody is prepared. The sundial in mild dispute with the hour, the key left in a door, the blue bottle bright upon iron, a decanter measured to a nicety, a library chair not quite near enough to the table, the vicar's speech unwritten, a matriarch's smile practised as a weapon. All this lay upon the lawn at Langford Hall, like an arrangement of chessmen at the end of an opening. No one had yet moved in earnest, and yet each had already chosen a piece to guard and a piece to sacrifice. Hastings, who had survived foolishness by obeying his instincts, told himself that he was fanciful and that such moods were the privilege of summer. He returned to the company with the intention, which he fulfilled, of being useful. He fetched a shawl, he found a chair, he laughed at a joke. When the damask cloth was spread upon the long table for tea, and the sandwiches arranged the English way, cucumber, watercress, egg and cress, salmon, he felt the reassurance of ritual. Tea has a way of telling the world to compose itself. From the open windows of the library came a faint sound, no more than the whisper of paper against paper, as if a letter had been folded or unfolded. Hastings, who had once, in another house, heard the same small sound and discovered later what a difference a folded letter can make, turned his head and saw no one. He would afterwards remember that he had at that moment considered going in and asking Lady Eleanor some trivial question about the family portraits. He did not go. For the present, the scene held him. There were, after all, toasts to make and speeches to avoid and, God bless English gardens, wasps to outwit. Even then, even so early in the afternoon, the wisteria's purple ropes seemed to droop lower than before, as if burdened with the knowledge of something that the rest of them, basking in the careful light, had not yet been told. The wisteria swayed slightly in the faint breeze, its blossoms releasing their soft perfume like the sigh of something ancient and knowing. The laughter from the lawn had grown scattered, thin, as though even mirth had begun to hesitate. Hastings, whose temperament was more solid than subtle, could not have said why he felt uneasy. There was no reason in the world to suppose that anything was amiss at Langford Hall, and yet standing there with the last of his tea cooling between his fingers, he had the impression that the whole scene, the guests, the silver teapot glinting in the sun, The neat napkins, folded like white lilies, was as delicate as a stage set, beautiful but temporary, held together by invisible wires. He was looking for Lady Eleanor when the sound came. It was not a scream, nothing so dramatic, but a sharp, strangled cry, muffled almost immediately, and then silence. Cups trembled on their saucers. Every face turned towards the source of the sound, the Wisteria walk, deep in purple shadow. For a second, no one moved. It was Lydia who broke the stillness, her voice trembling. "Mother?" Julian was already on his feet. "Stay here, all of you." He crossed the lawn in 3 long strides. Hastings followed at once, his soldier's instinct moving before his reason could catch up. The air under the pergola felt cooler. The light was dappled and uncertain. Lady Eleanor lay upon the grass, half reclined against one of the carved benches, her head at an awkward angle. The ivory fichu was stained, no, not stained, Hastings realized, but marked, a pale brown spreading from the lips. Her fan lay open beside her, the invitation card she had been holding fluttering across the ground like a pale bird. "Good Lord," Julian breathed. "She's fainted," Dr. Merrick pushed past them with professional briskness. "Stand back, Langford, if you please." He knelt, pressed his fingers to her throat, and waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft rustle of wisteria petals falling one by one onto her shoulder. Then Merrick's expression changed. "She's gone," he said quietly. "Lady Eleanor is dead." For a long moment, the words hung suspended in the scented air. Hastings heard Vera Alton's voice behind them, steady and low. "Dead? But how? She was speaking not 10 minutes ago." The doctor's reply came in the clipped tones of one struggling with surprise. "Heart failure, perhaps. The heat, her condition," he broke off, frowning at the decanter that had been placed on the nearby stone ledge. "Though she had her tonic not long ago." Julian's face was ashen. "Her tonic, yes, I saw Merrick give it to her." "I measured it myself," Merrick said. 2 teaspoonfuls of the restorative compound she has taken these past months. There was nothing unusual in it." He reached for the decanter and sniffed, then drew back sharply. "This is strange. There's an odor, faint, bitter." "Bitter?" Hastings echoed. "Yes." The doctor straightened, his face tight. "Something here is not as it should be." Mrs. Phipps had come up, crossing herself in a gesture as old as fear. "Her ladyship had no enemies," she murmured. "Not here, not in her own garden." "No enemies," said Mr. Vale softly, "is often another way of saying many." The remark earned him a sharp look from Julian, but Hastings found himself glancing again at the decanter, at the tiny measuring glass beside it. A few drops clung to the inside, shining amber. The wisteria's long tendrils swayed overhead, as if listening. Dr. Merrick rose. "This is no fainting fit. We must send for the police at once." Vera touched Julian's arm gently. "Let me do it," she said. "You shouldn't." He shook his head. "No, I will. Merrick, stay here. Hastings, would you?" "I'll remain," Hastings said at once. He watched Julian hurry towards the house, his figure cutting through the sunlight, and then turned back to the still form under the wisteria. Death, which had been a rumor only a breath ago, now sat among them like an uninvited guest. They covered her with a shawl, Mrs. Phipps's doing, performed with quiet precision. Vera knelt beside her future mother-in-law, her hand hovering, but never touching. Lydia stood apart, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together. "It's not possible," she whispered. "She was fine. She said—" She stopped herself, biting back the rest. "What did she say?" Hastings asked gently. Lydia looked at him as if waking from a dream. "Nothing? Nothing important?" But her eyes were frightened. The arrival of Inspector Hughes from the county constabulary some 40 minutes later brought order, or what passes for it in the immediate aftermath of death. He was a square man, methodical, with the kind of politeness that comes from habit rather than nature. Hastings explained what had happened, as did the others. The inspector listened, asked for the decanter, and frowned when he smelled it. "We'll have this sent to the laboratory," he said. "Until we know what was in it, no one touches anything." Julian stood near the veranda, silent, his hand still clenched around the telegram he had half written to the family solicitor. The air felt heavier, the evening drawing close. Hastings found himself restless. The inspector was efficient, but the questions came slowly, mechanically, names, times, movements. All necessary, all lifeless. He could almost hear Poirot's voice, bright and exacting. "Mon ami, one does not measure a crime by its minutes, but by its motives." He smiled faintly at the memory, and then started, for the sound of an approaching motor car broke through the hush of the evening. The car drew up before the front steps. A small man alighted, brushed a speck of dust from his immaculate cuff, and surveyed the scene with keen, appraising eyes. Hastings gave an exclamation of astonishment and delight. "Poirot!" The Belgian detective inclined his head, the corners of his moustache immaculate, his gaze sharp as the edge of a scalpel. "My dear Hastings," he said in his precise, musical voice, "I was on my way to visit you, and instead, it seems, I arrived to find tragedy awaiting beneath the flowers." He looked past Hastings, his eyes falling upon the motionless figure under the wisteria. He sighed softly. "Always," he murmured, "it is the most beautiful places that hide the most ugly of secrets." The inspector turned sharply. "And who might this be?" Hastings drew himself up a little. "This, Inspector, is Monsieur Hercule Poirot." Poirot inclined his head again, modestly but with assurance. "At your service, monsieur. Perhaps you will permit me, as a friend of Captain Hastings, to observe a little. I have the experience of such, how shall we say, melancholy occasions." Inspector Hughes hesitated, but something in Poirot's calm authority disarmed resistance. "You may observe," he said curtly, "but understand, this is a police matter." "Mais naturellement," said Poirot with a small bow. "I am content to see only what is there to be seen." He walked to where Lady Eleanor lay and stood for a moment in silence, his hands clasped before him. His eyes, sharp and methodical, travelled from the fan on the grass to the decanter to the faint ring of moisture on the stone bench. Then, stooping delicately, he picked up the invitation card that had lain near her hand. "A fete, I see," he murmured. "An engagement, a garden, a family reunited, a Hastings. We have all the ingredients, only one thing is missing." "What's that?" Hastings asked quietly. Poirot's grey eyes lifted to his. "The truth. It hides itself perhaps beneath these flowers, but it will not hide long from Hercule Poirot." He looked again at the wisteria above them, the blossoms trembling faintly in the evening breeze. "Even the flowers," he said softly, "are beginning to droop. They too know that something here has died before its time." And as the first stars appeared beyond the roofline of Langford Hall, Poirot turned once more to the silent circle of faces: Julian, Vera, Lydia, Dr. Merrick, Vale, Mrs. Phipps, and his expression, though gentle, had already become the look of a man who sees more than he allows himself to say. The investigation had begun. The night had fallen softly over Kingsmarrow, its quiet pressing close upon the lawns and terraces of Langford Hall. From the house, a few windows glowed faintly, throwing rectangles of lamplight upon the garden gravel. The rest of the estate lay in a hush so complete that the chirping of crickets by the ornamental lake seemed almost indecently loud. Hastings sat by the library hearth, his teacup cooling untouched beside him. Inspector Hughes had retired to his temporary quarters in the study, there to prepare his initial report and await the result of the chemist's analysis on the mysterious tonic. Upstairs, the servants had been sent to their rooms under Mrs. Phipps's grim supervision, though Hastings had noticed that not one of them had gone willingly. There was, he thought, an unspoken superstition at work. No one liked to leave the dead unattended, least of all in their own house. By the fire stood Poirot, small, composed, immaculate, and incongruously serene in the midst of tragedy. He had declined dinner, declaring that the stomach, it must be calm when the brain must think. He now studied the decanter upon the library table, his head tilted like that of a bird examining a seed. "It is curious, mon ami," he said at last. "Always, in the English country house, there is the ritual of tea, of tonic, of a little medicine in the afternoon. How many crimes, do you suppose, begin politely in a glass?" "Too many, I'd wager," said Hastings grimly. "Dr. Merrick swears he prepared the mixture himself." "Eh bien," said Poirot, lifting a small spoon to examine the liquid residue under the lamp. "Then either Dr. Merrick made an error, unlikely, for he is a man of method, or someone took advantage of his precision to introduce another element." "You mean poison?" Poirot spread his hands delicately. "What else, mon ami? Lady Eleanor was not ill enough to die within 10 minutes of conversation. The faint bitterness that Dr. Merrick smelled, that tells us much. To detect bitterness through such an odour means that the substance must be one that affronts the nose as well as the palate. Something alkaloid, perhaps." "Good Lord," murmured Hastings. "You mean strychnine?" Poirot shook his head gently. "Non, non, strychnine announces itself with violence, convulsions, agony. Our poor lady suffered no such display. She sat, she spoke, and she fell still, quietly. It was the work of something subtle, swift, yes, but not theatrical. I should not be surprised if the chemist confirms digitalis, or one of its charming relations." He replaced the decanter and clasped his hands behind his back. "Tell me, Hastings, you were upon the lawn. What did you see that was, how shall we put it, out of harmony?" Hastings frowned, recalling. "Nothing particular. We were all taking tea, Miss Alton, Lydia, Mr. Vale, the vicar for a bit, and then Lady Eleanor came down to join us. She seemed quite herself, a little cool perhaps, but she spoke pleasantly enough. I do remember that she took almost nothing, just a sip from her glass. A few minutes later, I heard that cry, and, well, you know the rest." Oui, oui, murmured Poirot. "I know the rest as you describe it, but not as it occurred. There is a difference. Tell me this, who poured the drink?" "The doctor prepared it," Hastings said, "but I think Mrs. Phipps brought it out." "Ah," Poirot said softly, "a relay of good intentions. How dangerous they can be." He stepped to the window, peering through the sheer curtains into the darkness where the wisteria loomed as a faint, tangled shadow. "Look, Hastings," he said quietly. "You see that pergola where the lady died? There, do you note the small bench to the right?" "Yes," said Hastings, "it's where she was found." "Exactly, and you see the table beside it there, where the decanter had been placed. Yet, in the photographs the inspector took, here, observe the faint ring upon the table. It is larger than the base of the decanter. Something else stood there, something removed afterwards." Hastings bent over the photograph. "A glass, perhaps?" "Perhaps, but a large one, not for medicine, but for refreshment. And see here, there are 2 faint rings overlapping. 2 glasses. Lady Eleanor drank from the smaller, yes, but who drank from the larger?" Hastings looked blank. "No one mentioned it." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then we must ask the glasses themselves to confess." There was a knock at the door. Julian Langford entered, pale and hollow-eyed, with the stiff composure of a man holding grief at arm's length. "Inspector Hughes asked me to see that you have everything you need, Monsieur Poirot," he said quietly, "and to tell you that the chemist's courier left for Kingsmarrow at 9:30. We should know something by morning." "Merci, monsieur," said Poirot gravely. "It is good of you to think of us when you have so much upon your heart." Julian's mouth twitched. "I only wish I understood what has happened. My mother, she was strong, healthy. She could not simply—" Poirot gestured for him to sit. "You are right, Monsieur Langford. Death does not come like a thief through a locked garden, unless it is admitted." I should like to ask you some questions, if you have the courage to answer. Julian nodded. First, Poirot said gently, was Lady Eleanor content with your engagement? The younger man hesitated. I believe so. She had, reservations, naturally. My mother was proud, too proud sometimes. She worried about appearances, but she was never cruel. She liked Vera, I think, or wished to. Wished to, Poirot echoed softly. Julian looked down at his hands. They were different women, Monsieur Poirot. Vera is modern, direct. My mother valued control, refinement. They admired each other at a distance, like two cats who refused to share a cushion. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And Miss Lydia, your sister? Lydia adored my mother. She will be inconsolable, though lately, he broke off. Yes? There had been tension. I can't say over what. My mother was secretive in her last weeks. She had letters, private ones, that she locked away. Lydia once hinted that they concerned some old acquaintance, Mr. Vale, perhaps, but she wouldn't say more. Poirot inclined his head. Mr. Armand Vale is a long-time friend of the family, is he not? Friend, yes, though I sometimes wondered. Julian caught himself again. Vale is charming, intelligent, but too polished. He has lived abroad, and that makes people here suspicious. Yet, my mother trusted him once. Trusted him? Poirot repeated. Then she no longer did? Julian hesitated. I don't know, she changed towards him, subtly. Perhaps something passed between them that I do not understand. I shouldn't speak ill of anyone tonight. Poirot gave a small, sympathetic smile. Truth is not ill, monsieur, when it serves the dead. You will permit me one more question. Had Lady Eleanor been receiving any visitors of late? Only Dr. Merrick and the vicar, Julian said after a pause. And Mr. Vale, of course. I was away in London 3 days last week, finalizing some legal papers. When I returned, she seemed quieter, almost resigned, as though she were waiting for something. Waiting, murmured Poirot. Yes, I think perhaps she was. Julian rose. If you will excuse me, I must see to my sister. She refuses to eat. Poirot bowed slightly. Go, monsieur, you have my sympathy. When the door had closed, Poirot turned to Hastings. What do you think, mon ami? Hastings frowned. It sounds as if Lady Eleanor was under some strain, but surely no one here would harm her. Julian, Vera, the sister, they all seemed fond of her. Poirot lifted one finger. Fondness, Hastings, is a delicate garment. It can cover love or fear or greed, and it is so easily torn. He moved to the writing desk and studied the blotting pad Hastings had noticed earlier that afternoon. With a pencil and thin paper, Poirot pressed gently over the surface. Faint words appeared, backward, incomplete, but legible enough. My dear A, the matter cannot be delayed longer. I must speak with you tonight, alone. Poirot's eyes gleamed. You see, the letter unfinished and yet so eloquent. My dear A, there are 2 possibilities, Armand Vale, or perhaps someone else whose name begins so. But which one awaited her under the wisteria, and what, mon Dieu, was she to say? Hastings stared at the ghostly writing. Then she was expecting someone with a reason to keep that meeting secret. Exactement, and if she died before speaking, then we must ask who profited by her silence. From the corridor outside came a soft creak of floorboards, a whisper of cloth. Poirot turned, his expression alert. The door opened slightly, and Lydia Langford appeared in the threshold, her eyes wide and bright with unshed tears. I beg your pardon, she said. I could not sleep. I heard voices. Poirot's tone softened. Mademoiselle, you must not apologize. Come sit. We speak only of your mother, whom we wish to honor by discovering the truth. Lydia hesitated, then entered. She wore a dressing gown of pale blue silk that made her look almost spectral. Her hands twisted in her lap. You will find nothing, she said suddenly. My mother's death was natural. She would never, never have permitted anything scandalous in her house. Poirot watched her closely. Ah, mademoiselle, pride can be the cruelest companion. But tell me, what was your mother afraid of? Lydia's head snapped up. Afraid? Nothing frightened her. No? Poirot's voice was soft as velvet. Then why, I wonder, did she lock her writing desk at all hours? Why did she forbid the servants to enter the library after noon? And why, Mademoiselle Lydia, did you this afternoon turn so pale when your mother spoke of Mr. Vale? Her lips trembled. For a moment, Hastings thought she would faint. Then she drew herself up, her chin high, eyes glistening with defiance. You have no right. None, said Poirot gravely. But the truth, mademoiselle, it has every right. If your mother died by another's hand, would you wish the hand to go unpunished? The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then Lydia whispered, No, I would not. She rose, her face as white as her mother's had been beneath the wisteria. But I cannot speak tonight. Not yet. And before Poirot could stop her, she turned and slipped from the room. Hastings exhaled sharply. Good heavens, Poirot, you frightened the poor girl. Poirot's eyes followed the closed door. Perhaps, Hastings, but fear, it is sometimes the key that unlocks the truth. Tomorrow, when the light returns, we shall see what shadows remain. Tonight, he gestured towards the window where the moonlight trembled faintly over the garden path. Tonight, the wisteria guards its secret still, but I promise you, before long, it shall speak. And as the fire burned low, Poirot stood motionless, his small frame outlined against the lamplight, his gaze fixed upon the darkness beyond the glass, where somewhere among the flowers, the ghost of Lady Eleanor Langford seemed to wait for her own story to be told. Morning light crept reluctantly through the lace curtains of Langford Hall, filtering across the polished floorboards of the library and illuminating the stillness that had followed the previous night's events. The house seemed changed overnight. Every footstep was subdued, every voice lowered. Even the clocks ticked as though unwilling to disturb the silence that death imposes. Hastings entered to find Poirot already at work. The little Belgian sat at Lady Eleanor's writing desk, perfectly neat in his dove-grey suit, his moustache immaculate, his expression one of quiet absorption. Before him lay a series of small objects arranged with geometric precision. The decanter and glass from the pergola, the fountain pen Lady Eleanor had used to begin her last letter, and a folded sheet of blotting paper upon which Poirot had been gently pressing and lifting impressions in the lamplight. He looked up as Hastings approached. Ah, mon ami, the morning it brings clarity, does it not? And also it brings news. Inspector Hughes has received the analysis from the chemist in Kingsmarrow. As we suspected, the tonic contained digitalis in a fatal quantity. So it was poison, said Hastings grimly. Poirot inclined his head. Yes, but poison is never merely poison, Hastings. It is an expression, how do you say, a letter of intent written in chemistry. Each murderer chooses his substance as he would choose his words. Hastings poured himself a cup of the black coffee that Mrs. Phipps had left warming by the fire. Then you're certain now that someone in the house meant Lady Eleanor to die? Certain? Poirot smiled faintly. In such matters, one is certain only of human weakness. But yes, I believe this was not chance. Digitalis does not drift into a glass by mistake. The hand that placed it knew what it did. He rose, walking to the window. The wisteria outside shimmered faintly in the early sun, its blossoms pale as faded silk. You see, Hastings, the clue lies not only in the act, but in the precision of the act. Whoever did this understood Lady Eleanor's habits, her hour of the tonic, the measure she took, the doctor's formula. Only someone intimate with the house could have acted with such confidence. Hastings frowned. You think it one of them? The family? Or Dr. Merrick? Poirot turned from the window, his eyes narrowing with thought. Perhaps, but let us not yet decide. We must listen, as always, to the psychology of the crime. Tell me, who stands to gain? Well, Hastings said slowly, Julian, of course. He inherits the estate. Poirot raised a finger. Inheritance, yes, but Julian loved his mother, no? That much is evident. He suffers. And love, Hastings, does not disguise itself so convincingly in grief unless it is genuine. We must look elsewhere for the seed of resentment. There was a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Phipps entered, her apron immaculate despite the sleepless night, her expression that of one who takes tragedy as another household duty to be managed. If you please, sir, she said, addressing Poirot with the deference reserved for a man clearly in authority, Inspector Hughes wishes to speak with you in the study. He's asking for your opinion before the inquest is arranged. Bien sûr, said Poirot. We shall attend him at once. The study, like the rest of the house, bore the stamp of Lady Eleanor's discipline. Polished mahogany, immaculate curtains, and a faint aroma of lavender and old paper. Inspector Hughes was standing by the mantel, his notes spread before him. His face bore the look of a man who has been through a long night of explanations that satisfy no one. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, he said, nodding. You'll be interested to hear the chemist's report confirms our suspicion. Digitalis, pure and simple. I've had Dr. Merrick's supply of it removed from his case. Says he uses it for heart conditions. And what does Dr. Merrick say? Asked Poirot, taking a chair. The inspector consulted his notes. That he prepared the lady's tonic as usual after luncheon. He measured it himself, sealed the bottle and placed it on a tray for Mrs. Phipps to take out at 4. He insists no one else handled it. Ah, said Poirot, but the bottle was unsealed when Mrs. Phipps brought it, yes? She added water to the dose. That's right. 2 teaspoonfuls into a little glass, just as prescribed. Then she left it on the bench by the Wisteria. Says she was called away by one of the maids about the linen and didn't see the lady drink it. Poirot steepled his fingers. So between that moment and Lady Eleanor's death, anyone passing through the garden could have touched it. Exactly, said Hughes. I've taken statements from the family and the guests. Vale says he was in the library. Miss Lydia claims she was sketching by the lake, and Miss Alton says she was arranging flowers in the morning room. The only one with no fixed position is the vicar. He admits he wandered the garden in conversation with the gardener, Quill. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Always the gardens, always the flowers. Nature, she hears much and says nothing. The inspector gave him a wry look. We'll rely on people rather than flowers, if you don't mind. There'll be an inquest tomorrow, but I don't mind saying, Poirot, this case is tangled. The old lady was liked, respected. Why kill her? Perhaps, said Poirot softly, because she knew something she was not meant to know. Hughes frowned. You've some reason for thinking that. Poirot rose and crossed to the desk. Only a letter, unfinished, unsigned. It was found in the library. It begins, My dear A, the matter cannot be delayed longer. I must speak with you tonight, alone. The inspector's eyebrows lifted. A? Vale? Perhaps, or perhaps another, but mark my words, Inspector. Lady Eleanor meant to confront someone last evening. She died before she could do so. The person she intended to meet is, I think, our murderer. There was a pause. The inspector rubbed his chin. If you're right, Monsieur Poirot, then whoever that A is may already know we've got the letter. Just so, said Poirot, and fear will make them act. We must watch closely. As they left the study, Hastings ventured, You're certain this A was the killer? Poirot gave a small shrug. Certain? No, but the truth, Hastings, she loves her disguise. It is always the simple thing that hides in the open. We shall see. The 2 men stepped out onto the terrace once more. The mist had burned away, leaving the garden sharp and bright. The wisteria hung heavy and still. Poirot stood very still for a moment, gazing down the long path that led between the rose beds. "Hastings," he said quietly, "this house, how peaceful it appears. Yet beneath its tranquility there is a war of the emotions, love and pride, loyalty and jealousy. Somewhere among them, one heart has turned poisonous." He turned to his friend, his eyes alight with that peculiar gleam that always preceded discovery. "Come, we shall talk with Dr. Merrick and Miss Lydia again. There is something yet that does not fit, something small, as always, but vital, a truth as bitter and as clear as Digitalis." As they descended the steps into the garden, the breeze stirred faintly among the blossoms, scattering a handful of pale petals across the path. Hastings thought they looked like fragments of a torn letter. Lady Eleanor's last message, scattered and unread, waiting for Poirot's little grey cells to piece together once more. The morning advanced with the deceptive calm of fine English weather, bright skies, still air, and a sense of polite restraint that made tragedy feel like a bad dream best ignored. The staff at Langford Hall moved about their duties with mechanical precision, dusting rooms that had already been dusted, polishing glassware that would never again be used by its mistress. Only the wisteria remained unchanged, its long violet clusters drooping heavily above the garden path, as though weighed down by secrets. Poirot and Hastings crossed the lawn towards the physician's quarters on the far side of the house. Dr. Merrick had been given a small study adjoining the servants' wing, and it was here that they found him, sleeves rolled, pipe extinguished, his spectacles perched low on his nose as he sorted through a heap of medical papers. His usually ruddy face looked drawn and lined. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," he greeted, attempting a tired smile. "I hear you've been turning this affair over in your mind. I can only tell you what I told Inspector Hughes. Lady Eleanor's death was beyond expectation. I gave her that tonic myself, and I swear to you it was harmless." Poirot inclined his head politely. "You are a man of science, Doctor, and you speak with conviction. Yet death, she is a visitor that requires a host. If the mixture was harmless when you prepared it, someone must have altered it afterward. I ask myself, who had the opportunity?" Merrick sighed and sat heavily. "Anyone might have, in theory." The bottle stood on a tray in the morning room for nearly half an hour before Mrs. Phipps fetched it out. "The servants come and go freely, though none of them would dare touch her ladyship's things." "Ah, but one does not always dare," said Poirot softly. "Sometimes one obeys, even when one fears. Tell me, Doctor, Lady Eleanor, she was of a strong disposition." "Strong?" Merrick gave a short, mirthless laugh. "She had the will of an army, sharp mind, too sharp perhaps. She ruled this house as her father did before her, firmly, sometimes ruthlessly, but never unjustly. People obeyed her, yes, but they respected her." "Was she well liked by her family?" Hastings asked. Merrick hesitated. "Her son adored her, her daughter—" "Well, Lydia loved her mother, but that love was not easy. Lady Eleanor had expectations, difficult ones. Lydia's temperament is delicate. She felt the weight of those standards. As for young Miss Alton, the lady's future daughter-in-law, Lady Eleanor tolerated her, I think, but there was no warmth." Poirot nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "And you, Doctor? You have known the family long?" "All my life," Merrick replied. "I came to Kingsmarrow 20 years ago. The Langfords were my first and most faithful patients. Her ladyship was a woman who preferred control, to the last breath, I imagine." "That, perhaps," Poirot murmured, "was her undoing." He walked slowly around the study, his gaze sweeping across the shelves lined with bottles and medical paraphernalia. "Tell me, Doctor, you keep your medicines locked?" "Always," Merrick said, "except, of course, when in use. Digitalis is among them, As Inspector Hughes already knows, I use it for certain heart conditions in precise doses. And was any missing? Merrick's brows drew together. A small quantity, yes. The bottle had been used more recently than I remembered. I assumed I had miscounted. Poirot turned, his dark eyes gleaming. "Non, mon ami, you do not miscount. The trained man, he remembers. Someone has taken advantage of your exactitude." The doctor exhaled heavily. "I knew this would come. You think me careless." "Not careless," Poirot replied kindly. "Only too trusting." They left him shortly afterward, stepping again into the sunlight. Hastings glanced back toward the house. "He seems an honest fellow, Poirot. I can't imagine him complicit in anything so dreadful." Poirot smiled faintly. "Nor can I. But honesty, my friend, is a charming costume. It fits many kinds of liars." They walked on, the gravel crunching softly underfoot, until they reached the edge of the garden, where a low wall divided the ornamental grounds from the wilder meadow beyond. There they found Lydia Langford, seated on the wall, sketchbook on her knees, staring not at the landscape, but at the air just beyond it, as though trying to draw what could not be seen. She started slightly when Poirot spoke. "Mademoiselle, you have chosen a peaceful corner. It is good for the nerves, yes?" Lydia closed the book at once. "Peaceful," she said, forcing a laugh. "Perhaps it looks so, but nothing feels peaceful now." Poirot approached her with gentle formality. "Forgive me, mademoiselle, I intrude again upon your sorrow. Yet I must ask, you were in the garden yesterday afternoon, were you not?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, I was by the lake. I like to sit there when the light is kind. I could see the pergola from where I was, but I wasn't looking when it happened." "You did not hear your mother call out?" Her eyes flickered downward. "I heard something, a cry, yes, but I thought it was one of the servants shouting at the dog. By the time I turned, people were running." Poirot studied her face. "Your mother, she wished to speak with you that afternoon?" "She often wished to," Lydia said softly, "but lately our conversations had become difficult. She had strong views about the engagement. She thought Julian was, how did she put it, throwing himself away on a pretty girl with ambition and no ancestry. I told her she was wrong, of course, and she told me I was young and sentimental. That was the last time we quarrelled." "Ah," murmured Poirot. "And she spoke of Mr. Vale? She mentioned him last night, I think." Lydia's fingers tightened on the sketchbook. "Yes, she did. She said she meant to confront him about something, but she wouldn't tell me what. Only that she had been deceived. I begged her to let it rest, but she said, 'There are debts even friendship must pay.'" Her voice trembled, and she looked away. "I shouldn't have left her alone. She was upset. I could see it. But I thought she only needed time." Poirot bent slightly, his tone low but firm. "Mademoiselle, this conversation you speak of, your mother intended to have it last night?" "Yes. She said she would see Mr. Vale in the garden after tea." "Merci." Poirot straightened and looked towards the hall, where the tall figure of Armand Vale could be seen on the terrace, smoking again as if nothing in the world had disturbed his poise. "Then I think, mademoiselle, you have told me something of great importance." "What do you mean?" Lydia asked, alarmed. "That your mother died," Poirot said gently, "at the very hour she meant to expose a truth, and that truth, I suspect, was worth killing for." Lydia stared at him, her eyes widening, but before she could reply, a servant hurried across the lawn toward them. It was Robert, the footman, pale and anxious. "Beg pardon, sir," he said breathlessly to Poirot. "Inspector Hughes asked me to fetch you. There's been another discovery." "Another?" Hastings echoed sharply. What kind?" Robert swallowed. "In the library, sir. They were cleaning the hearth and they found, well, part of a burned letter. It's got Lady Eleanor's handwriting on it." Poirot's eyes glinted. Ah, mon Dieu, the fire speaks at last. Without another word, he turned and strode swiftly toward the house, Hastings hurrying at his heels. In the library, the smell of ash lingered faintly in the air. Inspector Hughes stood by the hearth, holding a pair of tongs in which was clamped a curled fragment of half-charred paper. The writing was faded and scorched, but one line was still legible beneath the soot. "Cannot forgive the deception. Armand must." Poirot bent close, reading the words with a concentration so deep it silenced the entire room. Then, very softly, he said, "Ah, mon cher Hastings, you see now why I said, the truth loves disguise. It hides in fire, in flowers, in polite words. But now it begins to show its face." He looked toward the window where sunlight filtered through the wisteria, casting its purple shadows upon the floor. "The lady sought to confront her betrayer," Poirot said quietly, "and instead met her death. But mark my words, Hastings, the betrayal did not end with her. It continues still, walking among us on two very careful feet." Hastings shivered. "You mean the killer is afraid?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Mais oui. And fear, Hastings, is the greatest confession of all. We must listen now, not to what they tell us, but to what they cannot bring themselves to say." He took the burned letter gently from the tongs, his face thoughtful, his voice a murmur almost to himself. Lady Eleanor was too clever to write everything, but she wrote enough. Armand must what, I wonder, must answer, must pay, must die, we shall see. And as Poirot turned back to the window, the wisteria beyond seemed once more to stir, its trembling blossoms whispering secrets that only the dead, and perhaps one small Belgian detective, could understand. By the next morning, Langford Hall had begun to lose the sheen of decorum that had carried it through the initial shock of death. The household had exhausted its supply of whispered condolences, and in their place came a taut, watchful silence. Grief, in polite society, never lingers in its rawest form. It hardens instead into suspicion. Even the servants moved about with measured caution, as though they feared that every clinking teacup might be mistaken for a clue. Hastings stood at the breakfast-room window, gazing across the misty lawns. The wisteria shimmered faintly in the early light, a ghostly violet curtain swaying over the scene of the crime. He turned as Poirot entered, neat as ever in a dark morning suit, a single sprig of lavender in his buttonhole. He looked, Hastings thought, more like a man attending a wedding than one investigating a murder. "Mon ami," said Poirot cheerfully, "it is a fine morning for the exercise of the brain. You have eaten? No, you are wise. The stomach, when it is full, makes the mind sleepy." Hastings smiled faintly. "I can't say I feel particularly hungry." "Ah," said Poirot, "because your conscience, it is awake. You think perhaps that you should have seen something, that you should have prevented something. Eh bien, Hastings, that is the tragedy of good hearts. They always arrive 5 minutes too late." He moved toward the table, where a small wooden box had been placed beside the tea tray. "Inspector Hughes was kind enough to send me this. It is the small casket from Lady Eleanor's writing desk. He found it locked, but being an Englishman, he is too polite to break it open before consulting me." Hastings raised an eyebrow. "And you're not too polite?" "Non," said Poirot gravely. "Politeness, Hastings, is a virtue only until it hinders the truth." He produced a delicate key from his pocket, the one he had quietly taken from Lady Eleanor's ring of household keys the night before, and turned it in the lock. The lid opened with a small sigh, releasing a faint perfume of dried lavender and paper. Inside lay several neatly folded letters tied with ribbon, a brooch of old-fashioned design, and a small envelope marked Private, A.V. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A.V. Armanvale, naturellement." He untied the ribbon and drew out the topmost letter. It was dated 6 years earlier. "Listen, Hastings," he said softly. "My dear Eleanor, You ask too much of friendship. I cannot undo what is done, and if you reveal the truth, you ruin us both. Believe that I loved you once, though in my way, and forgive me the rest." Hastings stared. Good heavens, they were lovers? Poirot replaced the letter carefully. "Ah, perhaps once, or perhaps, mon ami. This was a transaction of another kind entirely. Love and guilt, they wear the same perfume until one learns to tell them apart. But you see what this means. Lady Eleanor knew something about Vale, something from the past that he feared might come to light." "Then you believe he killed her?" Poirot's expression softened. "I believe, Hastings, that Mr. Vale's life has become suddenly uncomfortable." He replaced the box, relocked it, and drew the curtains aside. "You will find, Hastings, that the guilty man never hides himself completely. He waits to see if others will point him out first." At that moment, the door opened and Mr. Armand Vale himself entered. He looked perfectly composed, dressed in a dark suit that was almost too elegant for morning. He inclined his head slightly. "Monsieur Poirot, I hope I do not intrude." "Mais non," said Poirot. "You come at the right moment. Sit, if you please. We speak, as you say, in this country, among friends." Vale smiled faintly. "I should be glad of friendship this morning. Inspector Hughes seems to think me in need of supervision." "Ah," said Poirot mildly, "perhaps because of the letters Lady Eleanor kept." For the first time, Vale's composure faltered. His eyes flicked briefly to the box, then back to Poirot's face. "She kept many letters. Sentimental women always do." "But not all letters are sentimental," Poirot replied softly. "Some are dangerous, especially those addressed Private A.V." There was a pause. The air between them seemed to thicken. Vale drew a slow breath. "Very well, Monsieur Poirot. You know, or you think you know, what passed between us years ago. It was not what the world would call a crime, but it was a betrayal of trust. I made an investment with money that was not my own. Lady Eleanor's, in fact. The venture failed. She chose to conceal it, for her own sake as much as mine. But lately," he hesitated, "lately she had begun to regret her silence. She threatened to reveal the matter to Julian. I could not allow that." Hastings started forward. "Then you admit?" Vale held up a hand. "No, Captain Hastings, I admit only that I begged her to keep quiet. I went to the garden that evening, yes, but she dismissed me before the others arrived. When I left her, she was alive. If you think I killed her to preserve my reputation, you underestimate both her pride and my cowardice." Poirot studied him for a long moment. "You are clever, Monsieur Val. You confess only that which is already discoverable. That is good strategy. But there is still one thing that does not please me." "And that is?" Vale asked, his tone steady. "Your calm. When the innocent man is accused, he is angry, indignant, defensive. You," Poirot gestured delicately, "you are only rehearsed." Vale's eyes hardened. "Rehearsed men survive, Monsieur Poirot, and if you wish for drama, you must look elsewhere. I've no more to say." He turned sharply and left the room. Hastings looked after him. "He's lying, Poirot. You saw that." "Perhaps," said Poirot thoughtfully, "but lying is not the same as killing. Remember, Hastings, he spoke of someone else who might have known of the betrayal. Lady Eleanor herself told her daughter she had been deceived. What if Mademoiselle Lydia discovered this old affair? What then?" Before Hastings could answer, a knock came at the door. It was Vera Alton. Her face was pale, but her manner steady. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I must speak with you, alone, if you please." Poirot bowed. "But of course." He turned to Hastings. "My dear friend, perhaps you will amuse yourself in the library. There are books there which do not kill anyone." When Hastings had gone, Poirot gestured for Vera to sit. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her voice low and urgent. "Monsieur Poirot, I believe I know who tampered with the tonic." Poirot's eyes brightened. "Ah? And why do you believe this, mademoiselle?" "Because I saw something that afternoon, something I thought trivial at the time. Mrs. Phipps was fetching the tray, and Lydia came in from the garden. She went to the table, poured herself a glass of water, and then I saw her hesitate. She looked toward the tray, and for a moment she held one of the bottles. I thought nothing of it, but afterward, after what happened, I cannot forget it." Poirot was silent for a moment. "You are certain it was Lydia?" "Yes, I am certain." He rose and began pacing the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mademoiselle, you have courage to speak. But courage and truth, they are not always the same. What you saw may be innocent. Yet I tell you this, Lydia Langford's soul carries a secret heavier than that small bottle. Whether it is guilt or grief, I do not yet know." Vera rose as well, her voice trembling slightly. "You think she's guilty?" "I think," said Poirot quietly, "that Lady Eleanor's death began long before her heart stopped beating. Perhaps in another quarrel, another betrayal. I shall see Lydia again this evening. And then—" He looked toward the window, where the wisteria glowed faintly in the sunlight. "Then the garden may speak once more." He turned back to Vera, his expression grave but not unkind. "You must be patient, mademoiselle. The truth is like perfume. It clings, even when we think it gone, and in this house the air is very full of it." Outside, the breeze stirred again through the wisteria, scattering its pale blossoms like snow. Somewhere, unseen, a door closed softly, and Poirot, still standing by the window, murmured, "Ah, Lady Eleanor, you are not finished with us yet." Afternoon settled over Langford Hall like a hush pressed between the pages of an old book. The air hung thick with the perfume of flowers, too sweet and too still. Even the bees seemed sluggish, their murmuring blending with the low rustle of the wisteria leaves. Inside, the atmosphere was equally subdued, polite conversation muffled by the heavy curtains of decorum and dread. The great house had grown uneasy under its own civility. Hastings found Poirot later that day in the library, standing before the cold hearth with his hands clasped neatly behind his back. His head was bent slightly, as though he were listening to something faint and distant, the kind of silence that holds meaning. A ray of sunlight, filtered through the tall window, touched the silver threads in his hair and gleamed faintly upon the curve of his moustache. "You've been very quiet all morning," said Hastings, breaking the stillness. "Have you discovered something new?" Poirot turned slowly. "Discovered? Perhaps not yet, mon ami. But I have begun to understand the pattern. You remember my little metaphor, yes? About the game of chess, the opening moves, they are made. Now we approach the middle of the game, the time of sacrifice." "I don't quite follow," said Hastings. "No, you rarely do until the end," replied Poirot with affectionate patience. "But you shall. Consider, Lady Eleanor dies after tea by poison placed in her own tonic. The means, precise. The moment, deliberate. But it is the motive, Hastings, that is elusive. Love, fear, revenge, one of these three moves the hand that poured the poison. Perhaps all three." Before Hastings could answer, there came a soft knock at the door. Lydia Langford entered. She was dressed in pale grey, her eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. In her hands she carried a folded piece of paper. "Inspector Hughes asked me to give you this," she said quietly. "He's gone to the village for the inquest arrangements. It's a copy of my mother's will." Poirot accepted the paper with a little bow. "Merci, mademoiselle, and you, how do you feel today?" Lydia hesitated. "As though the house has eyes," she said at last. "Everywhere I go, I feel her still here. And yet it's not comfort, it's accusation." "You loved her," said Poirot gently. "Yes," Lydia whispered. But she did not always love me back. At least, not the way she loved Julian. She wanted perfection, and I disappointed her. She could forgive many things except weakness. Poirot's gaze softened. And yet you stayed near her? She needed me, Lydia said simply. My brother was always away. The household revolved around her moods, her illnesses, her demands. You begin by pitying such a person, and in the end you almost envy their certainty. Certainty, oui, murmured Poirot. It is a dangerous thing, certainty. Tell me, mademoiselle, do you recall speaking to your mother the day before she died? Lydia frowned slightly. I do. She asked me to find a particular envelope in her writing desk. When I brought it, she looked at it for a long time, then locked it away again. I think it was addressed to Mr. Vale. She told me that she intended to see him privately the next day. Ah, said Poirot, the confrontation. Lydia's hands trembled slightly. Was it really a confrontation, do you think, or had she already forgiven him? My mother had strange ideas about punishment. She believed that humiliation was worse than death. Poirot's eyes flickered. Perhaps she wished to humiliate Mr. Vale, but perhaps he decided to prevent that. Still, you are troubled, mademoiselle. You hold something back. Her breath caught. What makes you say that? The tone, the posture, the eyes, said Poirot softly. They betray us all. Come, tell me, what do you fear to speak aloud? Lydia's composure faltered. It's not fear, it's doubt. After she died, I went into the library. On the writing table was a note, a few words only, scrawled as if in haste. I burned it. It seemed wrong to let anyone see my mother's private feelings. But now I wonder, perhaps it was important. What did it say? She hesitated, her voice low. Only this. The truth will cost more than he knows. That's all. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Ah, ma pauvre enfant, you should have kept that note. Still, what is burned is not always lost. He opened his eyes again, keen and bright. You have helped me more than you think. Lydia looked bewildered. I don't understand. You will, said Poirot with a faint smile. But not yet. For now, you must rest. There will be questions soon, many of them. And truth, mademoiselle, is like music. It must be played in the right order, or it becomes noise. When she had gone, Hastings turned to him. Poirot, surely this proves Vale's guilt. He deceived her, she threatened him, and he silenced her before she could expose him. Perhaps, said Poirot. But remember what I told you, Hastings, there is always another hand upon the piece. Vale's guilt may be only a shadow thrown by someone else's fear. Then who? Hastings demanded. Poirot did not answer at once. He walked to the window, his eyes tracing the path through the wisteria where Lady Eleanor had fallen. Last night, I dreamed of her, he said quietly. She was standing beneath those blossoms, holding her fan, watching a single petal fall. When I asked her what she waited for, she said, "The moment when silence begins to speak." Hastings frowned. You're becoming poetic, Poirot. Non, said Poirot gently, only observant. The dead, Hastings, they are the most precise of witnesses. They cannot lie, but they also cannot explain. It is for us to interpret their stillness. He turned abruptly from the window. Come, we must see Mrs. Phipps. They found the housekeeper in the servants' corridor, seated on a narrow bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes, rimmed with red, lifted as they approached. I've told the inspector everything, sir. I swear I've told it straight. Poirot smiled reassuringly. I believe you, madame, but tell me again, for the sake of my little grey cells. You prepared the tray for Lady Eleanor yourself? I did, Mrs. Phipps said. I poured the tonic from the bottle the doctor left, measured it as usual, added water from the jug, and placed it on the tray. Then Robert called me away about the pantry accounts, and when I returned, the tray was gone. Gone? Poirot repeated softly. Who took it? Miss Lydia, said Mrs. Phipps reluctantly. She said she would carry it to her mother herself. I was grateful, to tell the truth. I thought nothing of it. Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. And later? Later, when I went to fetch the tray back, it was still there, but the decanter was almost empty. I thought her ladyship had drunk more than usual. Merci, madame. Poirot inclined his head. You have told me exactly what I needed to know. As they left, Hastings whispered, Then it was Lydia. She must have had the chance to tamper with the glass. Poirot said nothing for a moment. Then, with a faint sigh, he replied, Or someone wished it to appear so. But the truth, mon ami, is like that wisteria outside, intertwined, deceptive, fragrant, and very nearly poisonous. To find its root, one must dig carefully. He paused at the door, his gaze distant. Lady Eleanor Langford was a woman of pride, and pride, Hastings, is never murdered without purpose. The killer did not strike at her body, but at her power. That, I think, is what we must understand. And as they stepped out into the corridor, the afternoon light fell across the polished floors like the bars of a cage, as though the very house were holding its breath, waiting for Poirot to name the hand that had disturbed its peace. The inquest was set for the following morning, and Langford Hall had fallen into that peculiar quiet which precedes revelation, the silence of people who no longer trust what they see or one another. Lamps were being lit one by one, softening the corners of rooms that had once felt grand, but now seemed oppressive, intimate, and heavy with watching shadows. Outside, the wisteria glimmered faintly in the dusk, its petals scattered like spent confetti over the terrace. Hastings found himself thinking that the garden had grown tired of keeping secrets. Poirot, however, was alive with purpose. He had dined lightly, taken coffee in the library, and then withdrawn to the morning room, where the great French windows looked out upon the pergola. The last streaks of daylight fell across his polished shoes as he stood in his familiar attitude, head bent, hands clasped neatly before him, eyes half closed, as though listening to music only he could hear. Hastings sat nearby, patient but uneasy. "You've been pacing for hours," he said at last. "You've spoken to everyone twice over, inspected the garden, and examined that wretched decanter until I could scream. Are you any nearer to knowing who did it?" Poirot turned, his eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. "Mon ami, I have known since this afternoon." "What?" Hastings sprang to his feet. "Then why in heaven's name haven't you told the inspector?" "Because," said Poirot softly, "to tell the truth too soon is to waste it. A truth must be prepared, arranged, like the final movement of a symphony. It must strike not as a guess, but as inevitability." He checked his pocket watch, nodded once, and added, "I have asked them all to join us here at 9 o'clock. The time has come to open the final act." One by one they entered. Julian Langford first, pale but composed, then Lydia, silent, her eyes darkly shadowed, Vera Alton, tightly wound in her mourning black, Dr. Merrick, grave and worn, Mrs. Phipps, stiff with apprehension, and last, Armand Vale, his elegance slightly frayed, as though the day had pressed upon him harder than most. Inspector Hughes followed, expression unreadable, notebook in hand. Poirot gestured toward the semicircle of chairs. "Mesdames, messieurs, be seated, s'il vous plaît. The hour is late, and the wisteria waits to hear the truth." Hastings always said later that Poirot's calm in that moment was more unnerving than any outburst. He stood small and immaculate before them, his voice quiet, yet with an authority that commanded the air itself. "When Lady Eleanor Langford died," he began, "we saw at once that it was not natural death. She was poisoned by digitalis, introduced into her tonic between the moment it left Dr. Merrick's hand and the moment it reached her own. The question, naturally, was, who could have done this thing? Who knew her habits, her medicines, her hour of taking them? His eyes passed slowly from face to face. Each of you, in some measure, had the opportunity. Mrs. Phipps, who prepared the tray, Mademoiselle Lydia, who carried it to the garden, Dr. Merrick, who mixed the draught, Mr. Vale, who walked with her under the wisteria, and even Mademoiselle Alton, who saw all from the window. Yet none of these details, mes amis, explain the heart of the matter, the why. He paused, drawing from his pocket a folded sheet of paper. This afternoon, near the sundial in the garden, I found a letter written by Lady Eleanor herself, and hidden with deliberate care. It was addressed to her son. In it she wrote, "I could prevent it from happening again. Forgive me for what must come." At first I thought it an admission of despair, perhaps even intent to take her own life. But no, Lady Eleanor was not a woman who fled from confrontation. She had discovered an old betrayal, the one that tied her fate to that of Mr. Armand Vale. Vale sat motionless, his face expressionless, though his fingers tightened slightly on his cane. She had once invested money through him, continued Poirot, money that was lost through deceit. For years she protected him, perhaps out of affection, perhaps out of pride, but now, with her son's engagement to Mademoiselle Alton, she saw history repeating itself. For she had learned that Vale's debts had been quietly relieved by another's hand, by the hand of his young associate, Miss Vera Alton herself. You see, Mademoiselle was not only a fiancée, she was also the unwitting means by which Vale hoped to restore his fortune. Lady Eleanor meant to expose them both. Vera gasped, colour rising to her face. "That's not true." Poirot inclined his head gently. "No, not entirely. You acted from generosity, not guilt. But Lady Eleanor did not know that. To her it seemed betrayal of her son, of herself. She wrote to confront Mr. Vale that evening beneath the wisteria. She never meant to die." He turned slightly. "And yet she did die, because someone feared what that confrontation would reveal. Someone who loved her, but also hated her power. Someone who had endured humiliation in silence and could bear it no longer." He looked toward Lydia. The room seemed to contract, the very air stilling. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, "when I spoke with Mrs. Phipps, she told me that it was you who carried the tray to your mother. You were the last to handle it before she drank. You thought, perhaps, to frighten her, a small dose only, to make her weak, dependent, vulnerable. But pride blinds us all. The poison worked too swiftly." Lydia's face had gone utterly white. "That's not true," she whispered. I never meant." Julian rose suddenly, his voice hoarse. "Poirot, stop this. You can't accuse her. She adored our mother." Poirot's gaze did not waver. "Adored her, yes, but also feared her. Lady Eleanor was a woman of domination. She crushed those she loved without realizing it. You, Monsieur Langford, escaped her control through charm and good fortune. Mademoiselle Lydia did not. She lived in her mother's shadow, helpless, inferior, desperate for affection, withheld. And when the engagement was announced, Lady Eleanor's attention turned to the new bride, leaving the daughter further eclipsed. Lydia rose now, trembling. "You think I wanted her dead? That I poisoned her out of jealousy?" "No," said Poirot quietly, not jealousy, pity. For yourself, for her. You told me she once said humiliation was worse than death, and so you chose for her the easier punishment. You measured the dose to cause a faintness, not to kill. But digitalis is treacherous. You saw her fall, and you thought it merely a swoon. By the time help came, it was too late." Lydia's breath came in short, ragged gasps. I didn't know. I only wanted her to rest." She turned to her brother, tears glinting in her eyes. "Julian, you must believe me. I didn't mean to harm her." Julian stared at her for a long moment, his face ashen. Then he sank back into his chair, covering his eyes. "My God," he whispered, "all this time, right here under our roof." The inspector cleared his throat quietly, stepping forward, but Poirot lifted a hand. "No, not yet. Let the ladies speak." Lydia sank to her knees, her composure shattered. "It was the day before she died," she said brokenly. "She had scolded me over some trivial thing. I went to fetch her tonic, and I saw the bottle of digitalis on the shelf. I thought a drop would calm her, make her sleep. I never dreamed." She covered her face. "Oh God, what have I done?" There was silence. Only the faint sound of the evening wind through the wisteria could be heard. Poirot's expression was grave, but not unkind. "Justice, mademoiselle, is often harsher than intention," he said gently. "But I think Lady Eleanor, proud as she was, would understand. In her way, she created this tragedy herself." Hughes stepped forward at last, taking Lydia's trembling hand. "You'll have to come with me, Miss Langford," he said quietly. "There'll be a statement to make." When they had gone, the others remained seated in stunned silence. The shadows deepened in the room. The last light of evening lay across the floor like a long, pale ribbon. Poirot stood at the window once more, gazing out into the garden. Hastings joined him, shaken. "It's ghastly," he said. "To think of that poor girl, loving her mother so much, and yet—" "Ah, mon ami," said Poirot softly, "love is like the wisteria. Beautiful, fragrant. But when it climbs too high, it strangles what it clings to." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Poirot drew the curtains and turned away from the window. "Come, Hastings, the case is finished. Lady Eleanor Langford has her justice. It remains only for the living to find peace." As they left the room, the scent of the wisteria drifted faintly through the open windows, soft and melancholy. The garden was very still, the moon just rising over the lake, its reflection trembling in the water like a pale eye watching from the depths. And somewhere in that quiet, as though carried by the evening wind, came the whisper of Poirot's own thought, part prayer, part farewell. "Rest now, madame. Your little grey cells, they have told me enough." And Langford Hall, at last, exhaled to nerve.